Around 360 BCE, an Athenian philosopher wrote a story about a great island civilization. According to his account, it had existed 9,000 years before the time of Solon, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It was a vast island power, larger than the regions the Greeks called Libya and Asia together. Its people grew arrogant, and in a single day and night, the whole island sank beneath the sea. The philosopher was Plato. The island was Atlantis. People have searched the oceans for it ever since. But the real mystery is not where Atlantis was. It is why a story its own author may have invented has refused, for 24 centuries, to die. To understand Atlantis, you have to start not with an ocean, but with a text. The earliest surviving account of Atlantis appears in two dialogues by Plato, the Timaeus and the Critias. No earlier version of the story and no independent contemporary record is known. Atlantis was discussed by later ancient writers too, but those discussions largely depend on Plato's account. Every map, every expedition, every theory ultimately traces back to these two philosophical works by a single Athenian writer in the 4th century BCE. And the way the story is introduced is itself revealing. In Plato's framing, an Egyptian priest tells the story to Solon. It then passes through the family of Dropides to the elder Critias, who tells it to the younger Critias, the speaker in Plato's dialogue. It is a long chain of retelling across generations, and none of its stages can be independently verified. Plato describes Atlantis in remarkable detail. A capital city built in concentric rings of land and water. A great temple to Poseidon. Walls covered in precious metals. Harbors, canals, bridges, and an enormous, disciplined army. It is one of the most vivid pieces of world building in all of ancient literature. And that may be exactly what it is. Here is what tends to surprise people. Most classical scholars interpret Atlantis as a literary and philosophical construction. They think Plato probably invented the civilization to illustrate political and moral arguments. And the reason lies in the way Plato used stories throughout his work. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. Across his dialogues, he regularly created fictional scenarios, what we might now call thought experiments, to argue a point. Atlantis appears inside a larger discussion about the ideal state. In the story, a noble, simple, well-governed early Athens defeats a rich, arrogant, technologically advanced Atlantis. The message is almost transparent: moral virtue defeats material excess, and pride leads to destruction. Atlantis works less like a historical memory and more like a moral fable, engineered to illustrate Plato's own political philosophy. Many scholars point out that this structure looks designed, not remembered. Scholars have also noted parallels with Athens' disastrous Sicilian expedition, in which an ambitious naval power was destroyed by its own overreach. The mainstream scholarly interpretation is that Plato created Atlantis as a philosophical and political story, although some elements may have drawn on real places, disasters, and historical memories. And there really were such disasters to draw on. This is the reason the topic is not simply closed. Even if Plato invented the story, he may have drawn on the memory of real catastrophes. Because something remarkably like the destruction of Atlantis genuinely did happen in the Aegean world, roughly 1200 years before Plato was born. On the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, there was a sophisticated Bronze Age culture closely connected to the Minoans of Crete, one of the most advanced civilizations of its age. At the town now called Akrotiri, archaeologists have uncovered multi-story buildings, advanced indoor drainage, and astonishing, vividly colored frescoes, all sealed and preserved under deep volcanic ash. Because around 1600 BCE, the Thera volcano erupted in one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the last several thousand years. The eruption hurled enormous volumes of rock and ash into the sky. It radically reshaped the island and its caldera, destroying much of the Bronze Age landscape and contributing to the flooded formation visible today. It generated tsunamis that reached parts of northern Crete, more than 100 kilometers away. An advanced island society, partly swallowed by the sea, in a sudden and violent natural catastrophe. The parallel to Atlantis is very hard to ignore. So did Plato know about Thera? This is where we have to be careful, because the honest answer is that we don't know, and we cannot prove it. The similarities are real. An advanced maritime culture. An island reshaped and partly drowned. A catastrophe centered on the sea. If a memory of the Thera eruption survived in oral tradition for over 1,000 years and eventually reached Plato in some distorted form, it could have handed him raw material for the story. But the differences are just as real and just as serious. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out toward the Atlantic, not in the Aegean. His date does not match the eruption date. He described a vast imperial power, not a single volcanic island. And there is no direct evidence that Plato knew any preserved account of the Thera eruption at all. So the Thera connection is a popular and plausible hypothesis, but it remains unproven. The ancient Mediterranean experienced catastrophes that resemble parts of Plato's story, but resemblance is not proof of direct transmission. There is also a more recent example. Helike, a real Greek city, was destroyed by an earthquake and sea flooding around 373 BCE, only a few years before Plato wrote. Helike may have provided Plato with a recent and vivid example of a city destroyed by earthquake and sea. If the scholarly view is that Atlantis was most likely a literary invention, why has the search never stopped? Part of the answer is Plato himself. He told the story with such specific and confident detail, real geography, a precise date, careful dimensions, that it reads like history even though it sits inside a work of philosophy. Part of the answer is human. The idea of a lost golden age, an advanced civilization erased in a moment, speaks to something deep in us. It suggests that greatness can simply vanish, that hard-won knowledge can be lost, that there might be secrets resting under the sea waiting to be rediscovered. The modern Atlantis tradition has a clear turning point. In 1882, an American writer and politician named Ignatius Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, arguing that Atlantis had been real and was the source of many later ancient civilizations. His specific historical claims have since been rejected by modern scholarship, but the book was enormously influential, and Donnelly became one of the most influential architects of the modern Atlantis tradition. Since then, Atlantis has been located almost everywhere on Earth, from the Caribbean to Antarctica, and tied to everything from extraterrestrials to lost super technologies. Almost none of it engages seriously with what Plato actually wrote. The search tells us less about the ancient world than it does about ourselves. So where does all of this leave us? The responsible position, the one actually supported by the evidence, is this. No securely identified archaeological site matches Plato's Atlantis in its location, date, scale, and political description. No accepted evidence has been found for a civilization matching his account. The mainstream scholarly interpretation is that Atlantis was a philosophical and political story, created by Plato to make a point about pride and power. But the story was not built out of nothing. The ancient Mediterranean genuinely did contain advanced maritime cultures. One of them really was struck by a catastrophic eruption and partly swallowed by the sea. The fear of losing everything to forces beyond human control was real, and it was grounded in events that had actually happened. Atlantis endures, in the end, not because it was real, but because it captures something that is. Civilizations do rise and fall. Advanced societies have been erased. The sea really has swallowed cities. The very Bronze Age world that Thera belonged to would itself go on to collapse a few centuries later. Plato may have invented the island, but he was writing about a truth older than his own story, that nothing, however powerful it seems, is ever guaranteed to last. Atlantis is not on any map, and it probably never was. What survives is a philosopher's story, retold so many times that the world slowly began to mistake it for memory. But perhaps that is its real power. Atlantis is a mirror. We look down into the deep expecting to find a lost civilization, and instead we find our own fear of disappearing, the quiet suspicion that everything we build might one day be gone. The island was never really the point. The warning was. Subscribe if you want to keep following the questions that don't have clean answers. See you in the dark.